All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Hudson Institute. And my name is Miles Yu. I'm the Senior Fellow and the Director of China Center here at the Hudson. And I really appreciate that you all coming here during this rainy Washington day. But I can see the spirit is high because the topic is very serious. The topic is, this panel today, we're gonna have, it's called the Sanctioned Voices. You know, we're dealing with China, and China is a country that excels at the punishment and sanctions, and overall, that's why we call this repressive regime, repression. So I like this title very much because it's called Sanctioned Voices. China can sanction your body, can put you in jail, can put you in your long life into a very long jail term, but it cannot sanction your voices. Most importantly, cannot sanction your cause. And I think that's why we're here together, because we share the same cause and we all echo the same voices. And those voices of discontent, protest, and most importantly, for a better future of mankind, because China is an existing threat, not only for people within the Chinese sovereign domain, but also for everybody living in the world, because what we're dealing with is a completely different model of governance that is based upon principles and values contradictory to the world that we have created in the last several hundred years. This is a new world order that is very different and it's challenging. So I'm very optimistic about the future of the cause, because the voices will never be silenced. And I think, today we're very happy to have you all here to share our common sentiment. Speaking of sentiment, many of you, including all the panelists, with possible exception of one, are basically sanctioned by China by name. And I said a possible exception because of one of our colleagues that we'll see here. Hudson Institute is sanctioned by China. When I first was sanctioned by China, many of my friends get really mad because they always say, why you, why not me? Because being sanctioned by the regime in Beijing is really, truly a badge of honor. So if you write your resume in the future time, if you're sanctioned, that'll be the first item on the honor and award section, say sanctioned by People's Republic of China for a good cause. So without further ado, I'm going to basically welcome, this event is co-hosted by Hudson Institute, but also we have good partners, the National Security Institute, and also National Endowment for Democracy, which is upstairs here. It's a huge establishment, and they're all gloriously sanctioned by China. So, so I'm going to basically turn the podium to Dr. Daniel Twining. He's president of International Republican Institute. I'm sorry, it's also co-sponsored by International Republican Institute, IRI. I think, aren't you the first NGO kicked out of China kicked out of Hong Kong, right?
We left before we got kicked out.
That's right. You left with dignity. Very good. Yeah. That's that's the sort of reverse George Costanza logic. It's not you, it's me. Yeah. Okay. So Daniel will make a brief remarks, and then we'll follow by our good friend, Joseph Wu. Joseph was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan during the Tsai Ing-wen administration. Now he's the chairman of the General Secretary, I believe, of National Security Council, that's what it's called. And he will speak through video to participate in this panel. And then last but not least, we're going to ask Damon Wilson, who is an august person here. He is the president and CEO of National Endowment for Democracy, which is really sanctioned by China multiple times. So, and congratulations. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll turn the panel to Daniel.
Thanks, Miles. Nice to see you all. We're making jokes, and I might make a few more, but of course this is a very serious topic. China is engaged in an extraordinarily global and sophisticated campaign of transnational repression. The objective is, as Miles describes it, it's not simply to preserve regime security at home. In fact, it's to silence and intimidate and censor voices abroad who do not want to live in a world governed by the values of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We can kind of laugh about it, some of us, but in fact, of course, it's also, as I know you agree, Miles, dead serious if you're a Hong Konger in exile or a Uyghur or a host of others with far more direct ties to China, people who have families back home who are threatened. I was very honored to be sanctioned in 2020 alongside Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton. My college roommate's mother, who I had not seen since college, saw me on Fox News, which is how I reconnected with one of my college roommates, saying, "What is Dan Twining doing on Fox with Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton?" IRI was sanctioned in 2019 for the good work of my colleagues who are here. My VIP meeting with Secretary Pompeo, Miles, when you were there, I got to sit in the big chair next to him as a result of being sanctioned. My chairman, Senator Dan Sullivan, called me and said, "Why you and not me?" I had a series of calls. The first call I got was actually from our friend Matt Pottinger, who was Deputy National Security Advisor, who gave me an attaboy, but also said, "Here's what you need to think about, right? No spring break in Hainan Island. Be careful about places like Cambodia, where Chinese police actually operate on the grounds," right? So, of course, it's not a laughing matter. We're going to hear from colleagues from Xinjiang and Hong Kong, who I think have much more authority than I do to speak on this topic. But first, I think we do just want to unpack for a second, what is the Chinese ambition here, sanctioning friends like Miles? My colleague Adam King was sanctioned after me. Adam, you're probably not ever going to be the CEO of Volkswagen, right? Which manufactures more cars in China than any other foreign company. Like, that's okay, but that's, what they're trying to do is not just silence and intimidate, but they're also, frankly, trying to limit people's career prospects. Luckily, in Washington, a calling card now is to be a China hawk and a China skeptic, but rewind 5 or 10 years ago, and many contractors and consultants and lobbying firms were doing quite a lucrative business, giving advice about China. Many of us were traveling to China, engaging with Chinese counterparts and friends. I even made it into the inner sanctum of Zhongnanhai once. We're not going to do that anytime soon. I think it's a shame. I still have Chinese friends we're in touch with, but if we are going to navigate a great power relationship without having a conflict, it would be quite useful for us to communicate with each other. The Chinese government, I think, made the big mistake of also sanctioning not just our senators who remain in office and are assuming prominent roles and positions, but also people like Secretary Pompeo, former Secretary of State Robert O'Brien, former National Security Advisor, our friend Matt Pottinger. I think it's a big mistake, just from a kind of diplomatic perspective. Sanctions are emblematic of an important phenomenon that I know we have so much expertise in this room that you all understand. There's a big conversation in the US, including at the political as well as the expert level and the business community, about decoupling, right? China, under Xi Jinping, made a decision to decouple from the United States some time ago. Sanctioning prominent individuals, including in leadership positions in our government, is part of that. Weaponizing this issue against individuals and important organizations like those represented here is part of that. It's part of a Chinese retreat from globalization and integration with the world, the kind of stuff many of us got excited about 10, 20 years ago. The Chinese Communist Party has made a strategic decision to go in a very different direction, making it very difficult, not only for many of us, but frankly for their own citizens, to travel with, engage with, communicate freely with the outside world. I think that's a shame. I also think it's a strategic mistake for China at a time when global public opinion has turned very solidly against China's power and its ambitions. We see this across the board. So looking forward to this conversation today. Miles, thank you for hosting us. Proud to be here with my friends from NSI, NED, NDI, all of you. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our friend Joseph Wu, really a formidable freedom fighter and champion and a hero who really is on the front line, unlike many of us, really on the front line defending these common and universal principles that we all agree to, and a reminder of the kind of world that we want to live in. It's a kind of world where a place like Taiwan is safe, and much more of the world looks a lot more like Taiwan as a free and open and prosperous society, and a lot less of it looks like the totalitarian state of China under the CCP. Thank you.
President Twining, Director Yu, Director Jaffer, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to thank the Hudson Institute, the National Security Institute, and the International Republican Institute for co-hosting today's event and inviting me to address this pressing issue. I'm especially proud to be here because the Hudson Institute, the International Republican Institute, Dr. Twining, Dr. Yu, and I are all on the PRC's absurd sanction list. But I have to make a clarification here. The PRC got me wrong. I've been advocating for the maintenance of the cross-strait status quo, not what the PRC has accused me of. But I still consider it to be a badge of honor and a certificate of standing up for the values we all believe in. The PRC has a long history of attempting to silence voices of critiques and opposition, both domestic and abroad. In recent years, it has even intensified its global repression, targeting Uyghurs, Tibetans, members of other ethnic and religious minority groups, Hong Kongers, human rights activists, and journalists living abroad, using tactics such as surveillance, harassment, and intimidation. It has created an environment where many fear exercising their freedom of speech and other basic rights. Moreover, recent U.S. indictments reveal a troubling escalation in the PRC's global repression, with agents harassing Chinese residents and operating covert police stations on American soil. This marks a new and alarming level of overreach. For decades, especially in recent years, the PRC has constantly threatened the people of Taiwan by means of economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, and gray zone tactics in an attempt to unilaterally undermine the status quo, jeopardizing the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. This escalation of regional tension has been evident in recent months as the CCP regime continues to use various pretexts to establish a new normal through aircraft intrusions into Taiwan's ADIZ, crossing of the median line in the Taiwan Strait, and major military maneuvers meant to intimidate Taiwan. In addition to military pressure, diplomatic isolation, and economic coercion against Taiwan society as a whole, the PRC also targets Taiwanese people, entities, and corporations individually. Since 2021, it has been imposing sanctions on top Taiwanese officials, lawmakers, business owners, and political commentators whom it falsely accuses of being Taiwan independent separatists or spreading disinformation. In June, China even issued the 22 new guidelines that allow its courts to try who they consider to be Taiwan independent separatists with criminal punishment in absentia, while the CCP regime has absolutely no jurisdiction over Taiwan. It clearly attempts to intimidate and silence Taiwanese people, create fear, and blame Taiwan's government for the escalation of cross-strait tensions as part of its illegal warfare. Other than fabricating charges against Taiwanese people, the PRC also manipulates the so-called One China principle and distorts the UNGA Resolution 2758 to claim Taiwan as part of its territory. This is often presented as a legal justification for the use of force. But let's be clear, using force, or even the threat of it, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. The PRC's actions don't stop here. It lays claim to the South China Sea and engages in aggressive actions against the neighboring countries, defying international law. This behavior is a clear violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and the 2016 ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Additionally, it also issued Decree No. 3 of the Coast Guard Law to go against all countries on the first island chain, further undermining their sovereign rights. So I ask, what limits will the PRC respect in its pursuit to impose its will and disregard the rights of others? Moreover, the PRC's global repression could have far-reaching chilling effects on universal rights to freedom of speech, association, and assembly in the free world, where people have been targeted or fear that they too could be next. As the PRC expands its influence globally and takes advantage of open societies, it is imperative that like-minded democracies work together to push back against authoritarian states that threatens our freedom and democratic way of life. This is why today's panel is so critical in raising public awareness and fostering collective efforts. The Hudson Institute, the National Security Institute, and the International Republican Institutes are premier American institutions with a proud tradition of fierce advocacy for freedom and true friendship with Taiwan. Please let me congratulate you to have a great event and thank you for the tremendous work you do. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Damon Wilson, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and it is a particular honor to follow our great friend, Joseph Wu. The only thing better would be to have him here in person, Miles. But I do want to thank the Hudson Institute, National Security Institute, IRI, Martha, Dan, Miles. Thank you for organizing this. The Ned family is here in force. Tamara is here as well from NDI. And in fact, the Ned family is here in force because the CCP is our top program priority, because it represents the greatest threat to freedom around the world. And this begins with our ironclad commitment to Chinese, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kong human rights and democracy advocates. It's also part of the Ned family's efforts to help Taiwan safeguard its freedom. But it's also why the endowment is really proud to support people from around the world, throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, who are helping their own citizens understand how China's engagement in their own countries undermines democracy and rule of law. And for all of this, Ned's often targeted, as many in this room are. But we know it's not really about us. So the CCP fears the people we support, people who are courageous, who are determined, freedom-loving people who refuse to be silenced. But Beijing sure tries. So I just want to briefly mention before we get into the conversation, to think about the motivations about the Chinese sanctions that are going to be spotlighted here. Sanctions that are clearly meant to deter human rights activism, but they're also a propaganda tool to change the narrative on the human rights movement. So of course, sanctions have a detrimental effect on many, especially the communities that the CCP is targeting for transnational repression already, such as Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs. And Hong Kong activists who've been subject to these transnational bounties, you know this quite well, they've talked about their concern, not the bounty per se, but about the impact of the arrest warrants on their friends, on their family members. How many of our Uyghur and Tibetan friends do we know have been silenced because of coercion their families face in the mainland, in East Turkestan, in Tibet? And we saw in Hong Kong an effort with the CCP's lawfare, the introduction of national security law, Article 23. It can be seen in some extent as a way to more formally legalize, if you will, to legalize its transnational repression, to provide a basis for it, and to go on offense to deter transnational coalitions to promote human rights. And the CCP's use of sanctions, they can also be part of a broader effort and be understood as such to gaslight the Chinese public and change the narrative about the organic, authentic human rights movements that they're undermining, they're targeting. So when Ned was first sanctioned by China first, and it was in August 2020, and then they did it again in November 2020, and since I've been there, they've done it a third time. I'm not quite sure why. But it was ostensibly in retaliation for the United States sanctioning Chinese and Hong Kong officials engaged in human rights abuses. But more than that, by blaming Ned, by blaming the endowment family, by blaming many of our friends in this room for interference in China's internal affairs, the CCP was trying to convince the Chinese public and other audiences around the world that millions of people on the streets hoping for democracy, struggling for democracy, that they were actually manipulated by foreign forces, Because the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement was supported by the vast majority of the people, millions took part in the marches, the CCP finds it necessary to rewrite history, discredit the frontline actors for change, to create this alternative narrative. And thankfully, most Chinese, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, they don't buy it. But we are seeing those around the world, particularly in the global south, who don't know the CCP strategy as well, haven't dealt with the long arm of their oppression the way others have. They're more susceptible to this effort of narrative battle. So we have to stand firm against this pressure, and our commitment to freedom and free societies, it is our most powerful weapon against the network of dictators, with China at the helm, working together to make the world safe for autocracy. And so we have to do everything possible in our means to support the brave actors who are pushing to support democracy in their societies, and do more to put a spotlight on their efforts for change, especially when the Chinese government is trying to change the narrative to focus on us and make it about us. It is about their own people pushing for a different future. So I'm really grateful for the team today that's putting a spotlight on this set of issues, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, President Wilson, for your remarks. President Wilson sounds pretty good, even though he started the income tax, the Federal Reserve. And then to my colleagues, Dr. Twining and Secretary General Joseph Wu, for theirs as well. We'll now turn to the panel discussion portion of this evening's event to discuss China's escalating use of economic sanctions and coercion against both organizations and individuals, including human rights and pro-democracy advocates. Examine the impact of the Chinese Communist Party's larger international economic and political coercion strategy on U.S. foreign policy and global security interests, and present solutions and policy recommendations to counter them. Before we begin the program, I would like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panelists joining us this evening, each of whom brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. We have with us today Francis Hui, Policy and Advocate Coordinator with the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundations. And Francis was the first Hong Kong activist to receive asylum in the U.S. At the age of 14, she started her involvement in Hong Kong's social movement. During the subsequent 2019-2020 protests, Francis briefed U.S. officials on the plight of Hong Kongers and organized global solidarity rallies with the allies in support of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. After the imposition of the national security law in 2020, she sought asylum in the United States. Currently, based in Washington, D.C., Francis continues her advocacy with the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong's foundation and her organization, We the Hong Kongers. In December 2023, Hong Kong authorities placed a 1 million Hong Kong dollars bounty on her head for colluding with foreign forces under the national security law. Next, we have Elfidar Iltebir. She's the president of Uyghur American Association, a US-based NGO advocating for the rights and freedoms of Uyghurs. A dedicated human rights advocate, Elfidar has testified before US government committees, participated in UN events, and raised awareness about Uyghur genocide, Uyghur forced labor, and transnational repression globally. She also engaged with the grassroots efforts, speaking at universities and community events. Under her leadership, the UAA has expanded its advocacy, supporting refugees and organizing protests, cultural events, and educational campaigns. Rounding out the panel, we have my good friend and colleague here in Hudson, Dr. Jonathan Ward, who is a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and he's a colleague of the China Center. Dr. Ward is an expert on U.S. China policy and economics, and is the author of 2 books, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China, and China's Vision of Victory. Both books are very good. They're on Amazon. It's good for Christmas as gifts. As a subject matter expert, Dr. Ward has been an advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense on Chinese long-term strategy and has briefed U.S. government authorities, including at the U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. Space Forces STRATCOM, and the Strategy Division of the National Naval Staff. Dr. Ward received his PhD in China-India relationship and the MST in Global and Imperial History from the University of Oxford, of course, in Imperial History, yeah. And a BA in Russian language and literature from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Please, panelists. Yeah. You can see anywhere, yeah. Elfidar, you can, Francis, you can see here. Okay. All right, so I have a whole list of questions, so may I ask them in no particular order. First of all, in June 2021, the CCP passed the anti-foreign sanctions law, permitting Chinese authorities to enact countermeasures on entities they believe have harmed China. This law is among several initiatives in China's legal warfare campaign, such as the 2005 anti-secession law and 2020 national security law that employs sanctions as a means of achieving favorable political outcomes with other countries. What does China seek to achieve whenever it warns the international community that it might use sanctions? So this question goes, Francis, could you?
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak to y'all. I think this is a strategy. Transnational repression is a strategy that the CCP has been using in the past decades. And especially with lawfare campaign, we're seeing that in Hong Kong, you mentioned about the national security law. They're using this on individuals and organizations, small or big companies, either holding dissenting voices or trying to disclose information that China doesn't want to be found out. And the idea of doing so, they're trying to do two things. They're increasing the cost for us to do things like that. Think about if any one of us are being sued. Obviously, the first thing we do is we find a lawyer, a legal representation. But some of us might have that resources, but not everyone does. And if you can't afford it, obviously the next resort would be to silence or to back down, to compromise. And I think that's what CCP finds most successful to do, to silence people, and they have done so in the past and successfully achieved that. And the second thing I think is to send a message to the society. When big companies aren't able to step up, then we have small companies are not feeling comfortable to step up as well. There is a chilling effect created in society which leads to self-censorship. And I think that's happening in a lot of our diaspora community, and in American society, in private sector, and government. And it's a way to put pressure us and threaten us to step back from what we're planning to do, and create an environment that discourage any dissent or freedom of speech, journalists, and for us to reconsider whenever we want to do such things, whether it's worth it to do it because it's costly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question is for Elfidar, if you don't mind. What do U.S.
If you don't mind, I would like to give an example.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, China uses the sanctions as a retaliation and also silencing and aiming to intimidate other countries' policies for its own economic interests and geopolitical interests. To give an example, in 2010, in Norway, the Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee gave the Nobel Peace Prize award to Li Xiaobao, right after China took retaliation sanctions, banning the Norwegian fish products and other imports. And it cost $1.2 billion US dollars for Norway, and it kind of influenced the Norwegians' foreign policies, and they seem to align with China's position in the international forums such as UN. And both countries they kind of smooth the ties, economical and geopolitical and diplomatic ties in 2016, which coincides with the building of the camps in our region in East Turkestan. So that's just one example of how they use sanctions to silence other countries and retaliate.
Okay, yeah, that's China, of course, also sanctioned Sweden when Swedish government protest against the kidnapping of one of the citizens from Hong Kong, Mr. Gui Minhai, who is still in jail, by the way.
Yeah.
So, and also Canadians obviously the two Michaels were arrested. And you look at the Norway, Sweden, and Canada, they're the nicest country in the world. I mean, the national symbol of Canada is a maple leaf, right? It's how peaceful they are. So, I mean, if you look at China's image in those countries, the most negative ratings in public opinion for China. So, China has this amazing ability to turn nicest people into its adversary. So related to that, the question I was going to ask you, Elfidar, is what do U.S. policymakers tend to overlook when it comes to Chinese sanctions? Where and in what ways could the U.S. policy better respond to those coercive efforts?
I believe that those sanctions overlook, U.S. policy overlooked the human rights implications of the silencing effect of the humans, especially the oppressed groups like Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and Tibetans. She mentioned the transnational repression earlier. They're basically trying to fear and silence us by those, China is trying to silence us, and US policies also need to protect those human rights activists and advocates in their policies. US, I think, should increase building multilateral coalitions to encounter China's coercion, implement targeted measures by sanctioning the specific people or entities that are related to Uyghur forced labor, Uyghur genocide. Those are some steps that we can take. And then the individuals, especially, we know just recently a Canadian government sanctioned several Chinese government officials because of their ties to Uyghur genocide. I think US can take more tangible actions and sanction more people that are related directly to those oppressions.
Okay, great. You want to add something?
Yeah, if I can add on, I think a lot of times we forget, we have to remember that it's almost like a natural instinct for China to rebuke whenever they get attacked. So sometimes it can be a real hit, but sometimes some of the threats are just a bluff, right? And if we don't count our cards carefully and just back down from that, after receiving those threats, it shows a weakness on us when this is how strong we're going to stand for our values. And I will give an example with, when the 45 pro-democracy activists who are being sentenced 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong to 3 and 10 years in jail, the US was only responding with saying, we're only going to impose visa restrictions on certain Hong Kong officials. It's extremely weak position. It's been 4 years since our administrations have imposed sanctions. The US has imposed sanctions on Hong Kong officials related to the Hong Kong situation. And for these 4 years, we haven't sanctioned anybody, but we see judges and prosecutors standing on benches and lending legitimacy for this regime. And at the same time, you have officials using the court system to put people in jail, to prosecute dissidents, and conduct transnational repression on people like me. Our only response is visa restrictions on Hong Kong officials. And then 2 weeks later, Paul Chan, the second top officials from Hong Kong, came to the US. And so who are these? We weren't even able to know who are these officials being barred from entering. So it's just extremely strong position. And we need to think about really what are the values that we stand for, and we need to stand strongly on those values, because then, you know, we need those we need to get leverage to seek for the release of political prisoners, and now we're not having those things when we're not responding correspondingly to these.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I want to share one particular personal anecdote here. When I was serving the previous administration, and one of the issues really is about how we should certify whether Hong Kong still has this high degree of autonomy. This is the annual mandatory report to the Congress as required by the 1992 Hong Kong Policy Act. So every year, I dealt with it for 2 years. Every time we had this argument whether Hong Kong still had the autonomy or not. Obviously, in 2019, 2020 has been deteriorated dramatically. And the counter-argument against getting rid of Hong Kong's certification, right, is always that Hong Kong still has judicial independence. That's the last straw. Press freedom may be gone and economic coercion may be there, but you got the judges. They still could be fair, right? So once that's done, in later part of 2020, and Secretary Pompeo basically said there's no way anybody can really argue against the certification of Hong Kong not having the high degree of autonomy. So that's judicial independence is very good. That's the last straw. So next question for Jonathan. How does the intertwined economic relationship of the U.S. and China affect each country's ability to sanction effectively? What are your thoughts on the functionality of sanctions in an environment of mutual economic dependence? And does the current situation favor one country more than the other?
Well, thank you, Miles, and thank you all. And first of all, I'd just like to say it's an honor to be on this panel for somebody that is focused on the strategic competition, military, economic, et cetera. I'm often asked, why does it matter? And the reason is what we're seeing right here. For people like yourselves who've been on the absolute front lines of this, you know, as Joseph Wu said, what limits will Beijing respect in its quest to impose its will? None. It will go as far as its power allows. And this is why we must win the strategic contest with the People's Republic of China, because the difference in value system is so obvious when one gets into issues like this. And that's the basis, in my personal opinion, of our need for ultimate victory here, which I think can be done through economic power. So particularly here, I mean, the use of sanctions, the value of sanctions in strategic competition with a major economy, I think presents an enormous opportunity really for the United States. What China has done now is weaponized the rise of its economic power, the fact that it's succeeded in becoming the dominant player in global trade in certain foundational industries, certain key technologies. But bottom line, I mean, their rise was possible through their access to the American market, to our capital, to our technology. Without that, it wouldn't have happened. And as a major piece of the world economy, they're simply able to push back on any state, on any individual, to the extent to which their power allows, through sanctions regimes that they're just now, I think, pioneering and developing. So their own use of export controls on critical minerals, for example, that's a card that they can play, and they're developing legal infrastructure to utilize that. The Counter Foreign Sanctions Act, which we talked about earlier, is one in which it essentially allows them to undertake asset seizures and detentions of individuals in the China market. So for Western multinationals operating in the China market, you know, assets are at risk, and executive travel is also at risk. It's something I'm hearing more about in the corporate sector, that people are starting to worry about that. But fundamentally, I think the United States has a giant advantage here, because we were the risen power, whereas they're the rising power. We still have the deepest position in the global economy other than trade and other than certain fundamental industries. So I think our ability to utilize export controls can go far beyond the high-tech focus of the Biden administration. You can reach deeply into the Chinese economic grand strategies from the 5-year plans made in China 2025, Belt and Road. All of that is composed of corporate entities that are state-owned or state-backed. So Chinese corporations and banks provide a very rich target set for the United States, whereas vice versa, what they're going to be able to do on the economic side is principally going to be about American and allied companies in the China market. So there's an inherent limit, I think, on their ability to play the economic game. But what we're going to have to do, in my view, is continue to build and develop our ability to have the upper hand in this contest and to overpower them with economic activity rather than through military conflict, even though they ultimately envision initiating a conflict with the United States. And if you look at the example of what we've carried out on Russia, pretty broad spectrum sanctions across a major multi-trillion-dollar economy. It's not obviously on the scale of China, but the effects have been extremely interesting. The destabilization of the Russian currency, the fact that the bond market rates have gone up to something like 20% now. I mean, that is just not a rate that works in real economics. And the fact that we've taken most of their firms off of the international financial system. I mean, there are many, I think, ways in which to approach this issue from the standpoint of human rights, from the standpoint of Beijing's civil-military fusion initiatives, and from their broader economic grand strategy. And once you roll that back, which I think we can do and must do, they become far less of a force and have far less global reach. And then on the other side of that, I think it's going to be vital not only for the U.S. And our allies and the general free world to provide absolute safe haven to those who have fled that regime so that they cannot be touched, not by lawfare, not by intimidation, not by anything. And that's going to be, I think that should just be an immediate priority in Washington and beyond.
Great, Jonathan, for that excellent response. Francis, let me just ask you next. There's almost like a tit-for-tat manner in terms of sanction between the two countries, right? You sanction me, I sanction you. I remember after the Hong Kong national security law was passed, U.S. government sanctioned pretty much virtually every vice president of the National People's Congress. That's over a dozen people. And we also sanctioned all the key officials of Hong Kong government, from chief executive on down. So much so that Carrie Lam, chief executive, could not use credit cards, right, in the banks because they were so afraid of being sanctioned. So recently, some people say we seem to have a little bit of a sort of a decline in terms of tit for tat until the 45 Hong Kong protesters were sentenced and the State Department sanction resumed. Could this reopen tit for tat sanctions? And if so, what could the renewed back and forth mean for the relationship?
Well, I think not just with the, you mentioned the 45 pro-democracy activists being sentenced, and then with the U.S. response. And now we have in Congress, there's a bill called the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices Certification Act, which seeks to give the administration a power to review and determine whether the HKETO should continue to receive diplomatic immunities and privileges. I think there is a huge opportunity for the U.S. to shut these offices down. But I think if we ever get that bill passed, that might also trigger some response from China. I'm not sure how they're going to respond it. They might up the level of my bounty. They might put more bounties on some other activists, and they have done
just for saying that alone, you will be sanctioned twice.
I mean, I might, because I'm involved in this advocacy process. But what happened in London, in the UK, is that when the UK, when Britain have this espionage case against HKETO officials, they actually upped the condition for the 6 activists who have already have the bounties on their head, and limited their ability to receive fundings from other people and the contacts with their with other people in Hong Kong, and a heavier punishment on people who continue to communicate with them. So I think there might be other ways that China will react to these things. They might retaliate on us, on US-based activists. They might not, restart what you call the tit for tat sanction. And I don't know. I don't have insights for what is going to happen, but I think China has a pattern of rebuking every time when they're attacked. And again, I think it's important to underscore that Hong Kong is being used by China and authoritarian states, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and other authoritarian states for a lot of illicit activities. They're working closer and closer together. They're deepening their ties. They're evading sanctions by the U.S., the U.K., and EU using Hong Kong. And we need to remember that what's happening in Hong Kong and to do things to stop that and hold China and these bad actors accountable. And simply, having sanctions placed on us or on people in America, I think we need to take that as a leverage to say, we need to find other opportunities as a leverage to hold them accountable, not just by, sanctioning and rebuking and attacking just back and forth.
Yeah, there's always this long age-old issue about the sanction. That is, how do you sanction a regime that doesn't care, particularly sanction individuals, right? They don't care about we used to sanction U.S. government imposed a huge fine sanction against ZTE. I remember the $1 billion+ fine. ZTE said fine, because it's a state-owned government entity. The government pay for it and it continue to do these bad deeds, right? So, and then Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State to be, is sanctioned twice by China, and they create a hot potato for themselves. So how are you going to do with that? And so when, but I think there's a different way of doing this. President-elect Donald Trump said in a tweet that the Chinese president promised me to put death sentence to those involved in drug trafficking, fentanyl to the United States. He has done nothing, so I'm very unhappy about that. I mean, this is one reason I'm going to impose 25% tariff. Tariff is something that Chinese government does care. Within hours of the president-elect Trump's tweet, and there was death penalty to the former chairman of the Bank of China, who is pretty much involved in all of this shenanigans. So let me just move on to the next one. It has been over 3 years since the U.S. and the EU allies sanctioned China for human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And the Department of Homeland Security recently announced a list roughly over 100 goods that were restricted under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. To what extent are these measures effective in achieving desired outcomes? And where could the U.S. policy look to apply more pressure on the CCP for human rights violations and protection international rights activist, Elfidar?
As you mentioned earlier, China doesn't respond to human rights violation condemnations, right? They do respond when it hits their pocket. So I think that's how we need to work it out. U.S. government passed 2 historic legislations, and one of them is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and that is quite meaningful, especially for Uyghurs when you think about it, because U.S. put its values more than its economic interest. So with this bill, we know the CBP, the Philadelphia, and the DHS is working very hard, and as you mentioned, put over 100 companies and entities to its entity list. However, the work and implementation has its own gaps and loops, which we need to work harder to enforce and implement correctly and timely. In order to do that, I think we can enhance multilateral sanctions, and we need to target additional companies. According to Laura Murphy's report, there were 5,000 companies that are linked to Uyghur forced labor, and we only added to the entity list 100 of them, right? Of course, again, support to activists and advocates. Their safety is very important, giving them asylum status, protecting them, providing them the legal base is also important. And also promote corporate accountability, holding companies, corporations strong, and implement a strict due diligence for those companies. So they do what they promise on their ethic websites, right? And also regular trade policies. As most of us, especially the people who work in the government, their pension plans, retirement funds goes to those companies that support Chinese government's genocidal policies. And as an investment perspective, we need to watch out and we need to use our leverages.
Yeah. Okay. Great. By the way, my earlier anecdotes about the Bank of China former chief was sentenced to death. I don't say the necessary connection, but it's coincidental timing. So that's what I want to clarify that. Next one, I mentioned earlier about the Marco Rubio. Actually, it's very interesting because the Chinese former defense minister, General Li Shangfu, was sanctioned by the United States when he was the chief of People's Liberation Army's General Equipment Department. And then when he became defense minister, this created a practical problem. He has to, defense minister in China is not really that powerful, but he's a public face. He's the guy who does the international engagement, but he's not necessarily has a command authority or anything. But that actually inhibited his official duty as a public face of Chinese government. Jonathan, this is a question for you. Marco Rubio was sanctioned twice, and he's going to be the Secretary of the State, and he's going to be the primary interactor with the Chinese government on bilateral relationship. How do you think that's going to affect the bilateral relationship?
Sure. And look, I think Marco Rubio is going to be a fantastic Secretary of State.
Agreed.
I think it was the most inspired choice I've seen in a very long time. And particularly because he, way before this was a popular issue in Washington, he was, keeping it alive and being a real voice on that. I think there's a tremendous amount of depth there, a lot of range across all of the issues, but it's also clear that I think human rights is at the core of his worldview here in terms of what's at stake with this broader contest that he also understands in great detail and depth. So, my personal view is that the work of the State Department should be to execute an American strategy that is sort of engagement everywhere but China. I mean, you want to get around the Russia-China bloc and deepen American ties, build the alliance system into the kind of force that's taking on these issues as a whole, so that we can bring the economic and military power that we actually enjoy across the military alliance system, in addition to non-aligned nations around the world, and start to reconstruct that and rebuild that around the People's Republic of China. So you start to do the work of fundamentally reducing the Chinese Communist Party as a geopolitical force, which you can do once you start denying their access to markets, technology, and capital through economic containment. Then you have to rebuild that world around them. So however they might treat him, I wouldn't worry about it too much. The big business, the big important work is going to be done all around the PRC, rolling back to Belt and Road, going after their strategic corporations, and getting our allies and friends into this contest in a way that's led by America, fully international, and starts to turn the tide against Beijing. And I think there's no one better to lead that, as long as it's accompanied by the right economic team with the right target sets when it comes to the sanctions that we could actually deploy to enormous effect, so that ultimately they just don't have the reach that they ultimately envision. We can cut that down now in the 2020s.
In the name of fairness, I think Wang Yi, Rubio's counterpart, should also be sanctioned twice. Sure. The U.S. government. Yeah. Speaking of I'm also a big fan of Senator Rubio. I mean, I think there is a very interesting reason for that, because if you look at the U.S. Cold War policy towards the Soviet Union, much of those policies were informed, advised by a lot of people with the personal and family experience in the former Soviet bloc. Tom Lantos, for example, right? Brzezinski, all those people, and Madeleine Albright, all those people who escaped communism, came to this country, and they have a personal understanding of the nature of the regime. Marco Rubio is a descendant of Cuban dissidents, or Cuban immigrants. They survived the Castro regime. They understand the systemic reason why Cuba is an adversary of the United States. So that's why I think people in Congress, like Senator Rubio, Senator Cruz, and several other Congress people with the Cuban associations, I mean, they have a better understanding of the nature of our adversary in China. So for that, I appreciate him tremendously. So I think he's also very articulate, despite the way he drinks water. Yeah. So. Good. So the next question I have is, There's an increased interest in the development of the economic NATO framework that could help protect the U.S. and allies against China's coercive economic sanctions. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the current international community infrastructure within the UN and other multilateral IOs, and to effectively respond to China's economic coercion? So this is the last question, the time we have for. So I'd like to have a very brief words from each of the panelists. Let's just start with Francis.
I'm just going to quickly go back to what I mentioned about the sanctions evasions problem in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong is being used as a sanction evasion hub, and we now have seen this trend that China is using that to assist the Russia war, assist Iran and North Korea and other authoritarian states, and we know that these states are against whatever values that we stand for, and they're coming to hurt us. They have similarities of shutting down freedom of speech. They track dissidents. They hunt down dissidents. They put pressure and economic coercion on people who try to disclose things that they don't want to be found out. So I think the international community has a huge opportunity here to, especially the U.S., to hold China accountable. It's a good leverage to recognize these activities as money laundering, as evasion, sanctions evasion, to designate Hong Kong as a primary money laundering concern, and also put secondary sanctions on these financial institutions and perpetrators that are assisting Hong Kong and these authoritarian states to evade sanctions imposed by the U.S., EU, the U.K. And there are a lot more things that we can do on this subject. We mentioned about transnational repression. All of these things are commonalities that authoritarian states do. And I think when we establish that there is repercussion, there is consequences for doing these acts, more people in the business community, more people in governments in different countries will, and even people in the party will start to question these type of strategy and the party's ruling. And that's probably a chance for us to change things inside China and the ways that they do these acts and stop them there. Yeah.
Thank you. Elfidar?
While there are international multilateral infrastructures such as World Trade Organization, UN General Assembly, or the Security Council, I believe theoretically they're supposed to address China's coercion, economic coercion. However, there seems to be a limitation of those work and the lack of strong enforcement. And also they can be very slow and not very timely. They respond not really impactful results they deliver. So especially for China, we talked about the EU and US allies earlier, that the EU finally passed the forced labor bill too, but the implication will take 3 years. You know, after 3 years, it's going to start. And by that time, China will already prepared and maybe move their manufacturers to Vietnam or Bangladesh. You know, they're gonna find other resolution for that ban. So I believe that are the weakness, and I will respond. Since I'm a human rights activist, not really US policy expert, I'll let others answer.
Sure. So, right, I agree with a lot of what's been said here in the sense that, you know, the institutions that we're talking about here were really not built in anticipation of the failure of U.S. China engagement strategy, which was 30 years worth of U.S. grand strategy. The idea that they would come in and become a responsible stakeholder, which everybody believed that on record, even if that's being rewritten once in a while. That was the end game, in a sense. None of those institutions were built to handle the failure of that outcome, to have a $20 trillion economy that's being essentially weaponized, militarized, all the rest of it, in a total contest with the US and our allies. So I think in that sense, the limits of those institutions are inherently there, and we're gonna have to have new rules and new ways around this. And you have to do that by leveraging really the overwhelming power, economic power of the alliance system in the United States on its own. So I mean, we're a $30 trillion economy now. We are 45% of global equity markets. You take U.S. allies from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you add India to that, we're 70% of global equity markets. China's 9% when you add Hong Kong. Fixed income markets, even higher. National wealth, even higher as a percentage. So we have all of that. If we leverage that and sort of rebuild, in my work called it reconstruction of the global economy, so that you start to get around the Russia-China bloc, excise that as much as you can from the bulk of the world economy that still remains in our hands. And I think different initiatives like allied sovereign wealth funds and investment banks that can outpace the Belt and Road, that can provide foundational capital for our own banks to go out and find real economic opportunities as opposed to debt trap opportunities that Beijing's state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks go and execute worldwide. So I think there's a lot of really important constructive work to be done based on the bulk of economic might that we still retain, and which, by the way, we won't retain that unless we use it in the 2020s. So I'm not too worried about what those institutions can do. It's more what can we do on the basis of existing economic power across in the U.S. and across the alliance system.
Those are very, very excellent remarks. I just want to add one final note to this panel. That is, when we say it's tit for tat, it doesn't matter. There's kind of moral equivalence. It's not. Sanction itself is not the purpose. It's not the game. Sanction it can be used to encourage change. There is Chinese regime is not only the regime of repression, but also is a regime of extreme moral sanctimony. It believes that it has a moral high ground on anything. So if we sanction them, our sanction would have enormous reputational cost to them. When we are in the West sanctioned by China, it's not a reputational cost, it's a reputational gain. Everybody is proud of that, that we're sanctioned by China, if you are fortunate enough to do that, because that means that China does not have the moral sanctimony, does not have the moral high ground. And so that is actually a very important thing. There is a moral aspect of this sanction. And I think with that, I'd like to thank the panelists here, and they're very excellent. They speak with power, with the insight, and also with passion. Hopefully, and we will continue this work, right? And thank you, and thanks panelists. And we have one final. No, let me just. Okay, so we're done the panel, and.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miles.
Lastly, we'd like to welcome one of the leader of our co-sponsor here, Tamara Wittes, yeah, great, yeah. She is the president of a National Democratic Institution, and we're a good partner here. And so, Tamara, welcome, please.
Thanks so much. And recognizing that I'm standing between you and food and drink, I will not take long. Let me say, first of all, thank you so much to this fantastic panel, Francis, Elfidar, Jonathan. Thank you not only for your insights, which I think are deeply important, but for the work that you do every day to expose the CCP's repression, to continue the fight for freedom, even at great personal cost. And I really salute you for that work. We have seen the expansion of this trend of transnational repression over the last decade, and it has expanded because it has not been met with a strong response by democratic governments. And that is a failing. It's a failing we need to correct. We've seen assassinations. We've seen abuse of Interpol red notices. And we've seen the kind of measures taken against our colleagues who are with us today. The CCP, quite honestly, has pushed the boundaries of creativity, I would say, in the measures that it has sought to use in terms of legal and economic coercion against its critics. Now, like my NED fellow family members, IRI and the NED that you heard from earlier, NDI has also been sanctioned by China in 2019, again in 2020 twice, and in 2021, both the organization and a number of our individual staff. To me, these sanctions are part of a set of actions by the CCP that really have exposed its intentions much more clearly to actors like those in the business community who had preferred to look the other way and take advantage of what the Chinese economy had to offer. As Damon said, from our perspective as a democracy organization, these sanctions only strengthen our resolve. And our resolve is to stand up for our partners from Xinjiang, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and from elsewhere. I think in the work that we do, one of the most pernicious myths that I come across again and again here in Washington is that support from the United States, from other Western democracies, for activists who are under threat, that kind of support is the kiss of death. That somehow standing up for them brands them as agents of America and delegitimizes them in their own struggle. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think what we hear from our partners all around the world is that they are stronger when we stand up for them, and that all of us democratic activists, all of the human rights community are stronger when we stand together, when we stand up for one another. China is attempting to wield its own legal frameworks alongside its influence in multilateral bodies and elsewhere as weapons against its critics. That's what we just heard about from this fantastic panel. And this event is so important to ensure that they don't succeed in silencing these voices. They're not only trying to hoodwink their own population, as Damon described, but also citizens across the world, especially in less developed countries, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere NDI works, we see this pernicious influence. We see this propaganda. We see this effort to shut down and silence evidence of Chinese human rights abuses domestically and evidence of its transnational repression. And this is part of a broader strategy by the CCP, right? To undermine democracy, to undermine freedom, to undermine the strength of the United States and our democratic partners globally. It comes along with propaganda efforts, it comes along with economic coercion, and everywhere we work, we confront this, and we and our partners work to combat it. So in closing, let me just say thank you so much to Hudson, to NSI, to IRI for convening us today. Thank you to all of you for the insights that you offered. Thank you all for being here. And this is going to be a long struggle, but we are here and we're not going away. Thanks so much.
All right, before I go to food and drinks, I'd like to thank my program manager, Colin Tester, who's not here. You can see he's not here because he's very tall. He's very noticeable, yeah. Oh, there you go, yeah. Well, thank you, Colin. Yeah, it was great, yeah. He did a tremendous amount of work, and so now we have some food drinks outside. Please enjoy and make some connections, and so we can work more effectively in the future. Thank you for coming to Hudson, and goodbye.